What if I told you that the Holocaust did not end in 1945? That what ended in 1945 was the killing, the active, industrial, state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others deemed racially or ideologically unacceptable to the Third Reich. What ended was the physical machinery. The gas chambers went dark, the crematoria fires went out, the Einsatzgruppen stopped filing their kill count reports. But the consequences, the legal failures, the stolen assets, the employed perpetrators, the suppressed history, the ideological descendants, those did not end. Many of them are still running. What if I told you that within a decade of liberation, governments in the Western Alliance were deliberately employing men who had participated in genocide as intelligence assets? Not because they did not know what those men had done, but because they calculated that what those men knew was worth more than what they deserved. What if I told you that the Swiss banking system held the stolen assets of murdered Jews for more than 5 decades before being compelled to return a fraction of them? That a major American corporation's technology was integral to the administrative processing of the Holocaust, and that this was not publicly established until a single researcher published a book in 2001? That the government of Austria officially denied its role as a Nazi collaborator state until 1991, 46 years after the war ended? What if I told you that the mechanisms of the Holocaust, the bureaucratic, ideological, technological, and political machinery that made the systematic murder of an entire people possible, are not historical curiosities confined to the Third Reich? That they exist in modified forms in contemporary politics? That the movements which deny the Holocaust happened are the same movements advancing replacement theories and ethnic nationalism today? That social media platforms have algorithmically amplified Holocaust denial to audiences that the Nazis could never have reached through any technology available in 1942? Tonight we're going to examine 40 truths about the Holocaust that are either suppressed, disputed, inadequately taught, or simply too uncomfortable for the mainstream historical conversation to hold with the specificity they deserve. These are not conspiracy theories. Every one of them is documented in peer-reviewed historical scholarship, in government archives, in legal proceedings, in the testimony of survivors, and in the records of the perpetrators themselves. They are truths that matter, not as historical trivia, but because understanding them is, in the most literal sense, protective. You cannot defend against mechanisms you do not recognize. This is going to take a while. If you're watching this late at night, get comfortable. Let your body settle into whatever surface holds you. Let your breathing slow. The history we are moving through is heavy, but heaviness and sleep are not incompatible. In fact, for centuries, human beings have processed the most difficult knowledge of their world in the half-conscious space between waking and sleep, where the emotional guard is down and the mind is open. Let yourself be in that space. We begin. Truth 1. The Nuremberg trials convicted fewer than 1% of perpetrators. The Nuremberg trials are remembered as one of history's great acts of international justice, the moment when the world established, for the first time in legal history, that there are crimes so severe that no government can authorize them and no soldier's orders can excuse them. The creation of the categories of crimes against humanity and crimes against peace, the establishment of individual criminal responsibility under international law, the 45 million pages of documentary evidence that became the foundational archive of Holocaust scholarship. All of this is real, and all of it matters. But here is the number that is almost never taught alongside it. Of the approximately 200,000 people who directly participated in the Holocaust as perpetrators, fewer than 2,000 were ever convicted of any crime in any court anywhere in the world. That is fewer than 1%. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg tried 24 defendants. Of those, 3 were acquitted, 7 received prison sentences, and 12 were sentenced to death, of whom 10 were actually executed, as Hermann Göring committed suicide before his execution could be carried out and Martin Bormann was tried in absentia. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, 12 additional proceedings conducted by American military tribunals between 1946 and 1949, tried 185 defendants in cases covering doctors, lawyers, military commanders, industrialists, and SS officials. Of these, 24 were sentenced to death, 20 were acquitted, and the remainder received prison terms of varying lengths, many of which were significantly reduced through clemency proceedings in the early 1950s. West Germany's own denazification process, which was supposed to identify and remove former Nazis from public life, processed approximately 3.6 million cases. Of these, the great majority were classified as exonerated or fellow traveler, a category that carried virtually no practical consequence. The system generated a joking description among the German population, a Persilschein, named after a laundry detergent brand, meaning a whitewashing certificate. Former senior Nazis collected character references from colleagues and religious figures and emerged from the process with clean administrative records. Benjamin Ferencz, the American lawyer who prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen case at Nuremberg at the age of 27, the trial of 24 men who had personally supervised the murder of approximately 1 million people, spent the rest of a long life, well into his late 90s, arguing that international law had failed the Holocaust victims and would continue to fail future victims until it was taken seriously. Law, not war, he said, in speech after speech across 7 decades. He died in 2023. The Einsatzgruppen he prosecuted had 3,000 members. He tried 24. The other 2,976 lived out their lives. Truth 2. West Germany systematically rehired former Nazis into government. The Federal Republic of West Germany, established in 1949 as the democratic successor state to the Third Reich, made a series of deliberate political decisions in the 1950s that resulted in the systematic reintegration of former Nazi officials into the government, judiciary, legal profession, intelligence services, and academic institutions of the new state. This was not accidental. It was a calculated political choice made by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's government, based on the calculation that the new Germany needed administrative competence more than it needed moral consistency, and that the pool of experienced administrators inevitably included large numbers of people who had served the Nazi state. The West German Foreign Ministry, reconstituted in 1951, contained a remarkable concentration of former Nazi party members, including several who had been directly involved in the coordination of the final solution. Hans Globk, who had written the official legal commentary on the Nuremberg race laws, the 1935 legislation that stripped Jews of German citizenship, served as Adenauer's chief of staff throughout the 1950s. He was never tried. He was never required to resign. He was, in fact, given the Federal Cross of Merit upon his retirement in 1963. The Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, West Germany's foreign intelligence agency, was founded by Reinhard Gehlen, who had headed the Wehrmacht's intelligence operations on the Eastern Front during the war. Gehlen brought with him an extensive network of former SS and SD officers whose wartime intelligence contacts in Eastern Europe made them valuable in the Cold War context. The CIA, which funded and supported the Gehlen organization before it formally became the BND, was fully aware of the wartime backgrounds of many of its members. The number of former SS officers employed in the BND at various points in the 1950s and 1960s has been estimated by researchers who examined the subsequently declassified files at over 100. The West German judiciary was perhaps the most striking case. A 2016 study commissioned by the German Federal Ministry of Justice examined the post-war careers of lawyers and judges who had served the Nazi legal system. It found that in the 1950s, the leadership of the Federal Ministry of Justice itself contained a higher proportion of former Nazi party members than the Nazi-era ministry had replaced. These were men who had written, interpreted, and enforced the racial laws. They were now writing, interpreting, and enforcing the laws of the Democratic Republic. The study was commissioned by a German government, which is itself a measure of how much has changed since the 1950s. But the pattern it documented had been known to researchers for decades. What this meant practically was that the West German legal system's apparent reluctance to prosecute Nazi-era crimes in the 1950s and much of the 1960s was not merely institutional inertia. It was, in many cases, a conflict of interest so profound as to make prosecution structurally impossible. The prosecutors who should have been investigating the crimes were, in several documented cases, men who had participated in the crimes. The judges before whom cases would have been tried had, in some cases, personally sentenced people to death under Nazi law. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as the people who had reconstructed it intended it to work. Truth 3. The CIA knowingly employed Nazi war criminals. In 2014, the United States government declassified a 600-page internal CIA history that documented, in extraordinary detail, the agency's deliberate recruitment and employment of former Nazis as intelligence assets during the Cold War. The report, which had been completed in the 1990s and classified for 2 decades, confirmed what researchers had long established through fragmentary evidence: that American intelligence agencies had knowingly employed men with serious Nazi air crimes in their backgrounds, had helped some of them escape prosecution, and had in several cases actively obstructed the work of investigators and prosecutors who were trying to bring those men to justice. The Gehlen Organization, the network of former Nazi intelligence officers assembled by Wehrmacht intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen and funded by the CIA from 1946 onward, is the most extensively documented case, but it is far from the only one. The CIA's own internal review identified dozens of cases in which the agency employed individuals who had participated in war crimes, including individuals who had been direct participants in the Holocaust. In several cases, the agency had information in its files about those individuals' wartime activities that would have been sufficient to initiate prosecution and chose not to share that information with law enforcement authorities. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists, engineers, and technical experts at the end of the war, is the most famous example in the public consciousness, though its connection to the Holocaust is more indirect. The program brought approximately 1,600 German scientists to the United States, including rocket engineers from the V-2 program, who had used slave labor from the Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp in the production of the weapons. Wernher von Braun, who became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and was central to the Apollo program, was a member of the SS and was aware of the conditions under which the V-2 rockets were produced. Approximately 20,000 concentration camp prisoners died at Dora-Mittelbau, a death toll that exceeded the number killed by the V-2 rockets themselves. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, established in 1979 specifically to identify and deport former Nazis living in the United States, identified more than 300 individuals over its operational life and successfully deported or denaturalized approximately 100. In the course of its work, it frequently encountered evidence that American intelligence agencies have facilitated the immigration of individuals whose Nazi-era records should have barred them from entry. In some cases, the agencies refused to cooperate with OSI investigations. In a few documented cases, they actively interfered. The political calculus behind all of this was straightforward and was stated in various internal documents with considerable frankness. The Soviet Union was the primary threat. The Cold War required intelligence assets in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and former Nazi officers with Eastern European networks were available and willing. The moral cost was acknowledged in some of the internal documentation and set aside. The men who had organized deportations, supervised shootings, administered camps, and filed kill count reports were rebranded as anti-communist intelligence assets, and their wartime records became classified information rather than criminal evidence. Truth 4. Switzerland held billions in stolen Jewish assets for 50 years. Switzerland's neutrality during the Second World War is one of the most carefully maintained national myths in European history. In reality, Swiss neutrality was a commercial and financial arrangement that served the Third Reich in ways that meaningfully extended the German war effort. Swiss banks accepted gold from Nazi Germany throughout the war, gold that included the melted-down dental fillings, wedding rings, and personal jewelry of Holocaust victims, processed through the Reichsbank and delivered to Swiss financial institutions as payment for Swiss goods and services. The Swiss National Bank knowingly accepted this gold despite evidence, available from early in the war, of its origin. When Jewish depositors began attempting to reclaim assets their murdered relatives had deposited in Swiss banks before the war, they encountered a system that had been carefully constructed to prevent them from doing so. Swiss banking law required death certificates to claim the assets of deceased account holders. The families of Holocaust victims, whose relatives had been murdered in circumstances that left no death certificates, could not meet this requirement. The bank accounts sat, accumulating in some cases, simply held in others, while the families who had survived rebuilt their lives without access to assets that were legally theirs. In 1996, under significant pressure from the World Jewish Congress and the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, chaired by Alphonse D'Amato, who made the issue a personal cause, the Swiss Bankers Association commissioned an independent audit under former U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker. The Volcker Commission, after reviewing approximately 4.1 million accounts, identified approximately 54,000 accounts with probable or possible links to Holocaust victims, with a total value at the time of their deposit that the Commission estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The Swiss banks agreed to a global settlement of $1.25 billion in 1998. The $1.25 billion figure represents the negotiated settlement, not an assessment of the actual value of stolen or dormant assets. Critics of the settlement, including several organizations representing survivor families, argued that the real figure was significantly higher and that the audit's methodology had been designed to limit the number of accounts identified. What is not disputed is the basic historical fact. For more than 50 years after the end of the war, a major European financial system held assets belonging to murdered Jews and their families, and actively obstructed efforts to return those assets through bureaucratic requirements that it knew the families of murder victims could not meet. And speaking of financial complicity in the Holocaust, Switzerland was not alone. The Reichsbank's gold transactions involved multiple European central banks. Swedish industry supplied ball bearings to Germany throughout the war. Spanish tungsten, essential for hardening tank armor, was sold to Germany until 1944. Portuguese wolfram followed a similar pattern. The economic architecture of the Holocaust financing was distributed across the nominally neutral world in ways that the post-war legal reckoning barely touched. Truth 5. The Vatican's Ratlins helped hundreds of Nazis escape justice. The Ratlins, the network of escape routes that allowed hundreds of Nazi war criminals to flee Europe after the war, primarily to South America and the Middle East, have been extensively documented by historians. What remains inadequately acknowledged in public discourse is the specific role of elements within the Catholic Church in facilitating these escapes. Individual Catholic clergy, most prominently the Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganovic and the Austrian bishop Alois Hudel, used the Church's network of safe houses, transit documents, and Red Cross travel papers to move SS officers, concentration camp guards, and genocide perpetrators out of Europe and into new lives in Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, Syria, and elsewhere. Draganovic, who operated from Rome, is documented as having assisted the escape of Croatian Ustasha leaders who had participated in the genocide of Serbs, Jews, and Roma in the independent state of Croatia, a satellite of Nazi Germany that operated its own extermination program. He also assisted individual SS officers whose crimes fell under the broader Holocaust. Hudel, the Austrian-born rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, was openly sympathetic to Nazi ideology. He had published a book in 1937 that attempted to reconcile Catholicism and National Socialism, and used his position to assist the escape of, among others, Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka whom we examined in the previous video in this series. The question of whether these activities represented a deliberate Vatican policy or the unauthorized actions of individual clergy is one that historians continue to debate, and the full opening of the Vatican archives, which has been proceeding in stages, has not yet fully resolved it. What is established is that the activities of Draganovic and Hudel were known to senior Vatican officials and were not stopped. The Church provided institutional infrastructure, safe houses, travel documents, references, that was used to shelter perpetrators of genocide from justice. Individual clergy who participated in this did so in the name of anti-communism, ethnic solidarity with Central European Catholics, and, in some cases, straightforward personal relationships with the men they were helping. The practical consequence was that Franz Stangl reached Brazil, where he worked freely until 1967. Alois Brunner reached Syria. Klaus Barbie reached Bolivia. Mengele reached Argentina and then Brazil. The Ratlins did not save all of them from eventual justice. Stangl was extradited. Barbie was extradited. But they provided years or decades of impunity that the families of victims experienced as a continuation of the original injustice. The message sent by the escape of a death camp commandant to a comfortable life in South America was, to the survivors who knew about it, absolutely clear. The world had decided that what had happened to them did not require the full weight of consequence. Truth 6. IBM's role in the Holocaust was suppressed for 50 years. In 2001, the journalist and historian Edwin Black published IBM and the Holocaust, the result of 7 years of research across archives in the United States, Germany, Poland, and elsewhere. The book documented, through corporate records, government archives, and census documents, that international business machines, the American Technology Corporation, had supplied the Nazi regime with the punch card computing technology that was used to identify, classify, count, and track Jewish populations across occupied Europe, and that IBM had done so knowingly and with active management oversight throughout the war period. The technology in question, the Hollerith punch card system, was the most advanced data processing technology available in the 1930s and 1940s. The Nazis used it for the 1933 German census, which produced a precise count of Jewish people in Germany by cross-referencing religious affiliation, ancestry, and geographic data. They used it for subsequent censuses in occupied territories. They used it to identify, classify, and compile deportation lists. They used it to manage the records of the concentration camp system. The administrative precision of the Holocaust, the ability to process millions of people through a bureaucratic system with the tracking detail that the historical record reveals, was dependent on this data processing capability. IBM's relationship with Nazi Germany was not conducted at arm's length through a subsidiary it could later claim was independent of its oversight. IBM's German subsidiary, Deutsche Hollerith Maskengesellschaft, known as Die Hamag, was controlled by IBM's New York headquarters throughout the war period. IBM customized the technology for German government clients. IBM trained German operators. IBM serviced the machines. When the machines were deployed to concentration camps, the servicing of those machines required IBM or Die Hamag technicians to be present. The punch cards were custom-coded for the Nazis' specific classification requirements, including the classification codes used to categorize Jewish victims by subcategory. The book was reviewed extensively, and its core findings were not substantively challenged by IBM, which declined to comment on its contents. The documentary record Black assembled was, in the assessment of historians who examined it, substantial and credible. The 50 years of suppression that preceded the book's publication were not the result of the evidence being unavailable. It was in corporate archives and government archives that researchers had not previously assembled in a single analytical framework. It was the result of no one having assembled it, and of IBM's considerable interest in not being identified as a company that had facilitated the administrative infrastructure of the Holocaust. The question of legal accountability was addressed by the Nuremberg trials only in the context of German corporations. American corporations, including IBM, were outside the jurisdiction of those proceedings. No American corporate liability was ever established. The book prompted congressional hearings, but no legal action. IBM made no public apology and paid no compensation. The precedent set by this outcome, that an American corporation could supply technology it knew was being used to process a population for genocide and faced no legal consequence whatsoever, is relevant to contemporary conversations about technology companies and their responsibilities in contexts of state violence. Truth 7. Major corporations that use slave labor faced almost no consequences. The list of major German corporations that used concentration camp prisoner labor during the Second World War is not a list of obscure historical entities. It is a list of companies that went on to be significant participants in the post-war German economic miracle and that, in many cases, remain major corporations today. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced Zyklon B, the pesticide used as a killing agent in the gas chambers, and that operated the Auschwitz-Monowitz labor camp using Auschwitz prisoners, was the most extensively prosecuted. The Nuremberg IG Farben trial resulted in prison sentences for 13 of the 23 defendants, with sentences ranging from 18 months to 8 years. The longest-serving defendants were released after serving approximately half their sentences. By 1951, all of them were free. IG Farben was formally dissolved after the war, broken up into its constituent companies, which included BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, all of which went on to be major pharmaceutical and chemical corporations. The executives who had been convicted of crimes related to the use of slave labor served their abbreviated sentences and in several cases returned to executive or supervisory positions at the successor companies. The companies themselves, reconstituted under new names, were not required to pay significant compensation to the survivors of their slave labor programs until decades later, and only under sustained political pressure from the U.S. government under the Clinton administration. The German Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility, and the Future, established in 2000 under the same political pressure that produced the Swiss banking settlement, distributed approximately 4.4 billion euros to approximately 1.66 million survivors of forced and slave labor. This settlement, negotiated half a century after the crimes it was addressing, reached many survivors in the final years of their lives, and a significant number of those who had been identified as eligible died before receiving payment. The average payment per survivor was approximately 2,600 euros, a figure that, for a person who had been enslaved and systematically starved for months or years, carried a symbolic weight its designers presumably understood. The companies that participated in the settlement, more than 6,500 German companies and the German federal government, did so without admitting legal liability. The settlement was explicitly framed as a humanitarian gesture rather than a legal remedy. This distinction matters. A humanitarian gesture is voluntary and does not establish a precedent for future cases. A legal remedy establishes that a wrong was done, by whom, and that the wrong creates an obligation. The German corporation's insistence on a non-liability framework was a deliberate legal strategy to avoid the precedent. It succeeded. Volkswagen, which used approximately 12,000 forced laborers during the war, established a fund for survivors in 1998. Siemens, Daimler-Benz, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, virtually every major institution of German capitalism was implicated. The reckoning, when it finally came in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was real but incomplete, late, financially inadequate relative to the actual damages, and structured specifically to avoid establishing legal liability that might inform future cases. It was, in the phrase used by Clinton administration negotiator Stuart Eisenstadt in the title of his memoir on the negotiations, imperfect justice. Truth 8. Austria officially denied its role as a Nazi collaborator state until 1991. The Moscow Declaration of 1943, a joint Allied statement, described Austria as the first free country to fall a victim to Hitlerite aggression. This declaration, which the Allied governments issued for strategic reasons related to encouraging Austrian resistance to Nazi rule, became the founding myth of the post-war Austrian Republic. Austria was a victim of Nazi Germany, not a participant in it. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in March 1938, was reframed as an occupation rather than the popular event it largely was, with crowds lining the streets of Vienna to welcome German troops, and the Jewish population of the city immediately subjected to organized mob violence and forced humiliation that shocked even some German observers accustomed to Nazi persecution. The myth of Austrian victimhood was extraordinarily durable. Austria did not conduct denazification with anything approaching the German federal government's eventual willingness to acknowledge complicity. Former Austrian Nazis were reintegrated into public life with minimal disruption. Kurt Waldheim, who served as United Nations Secretary General from 1972 to 1981 and as President of Austria from 1986 to 1992, had served as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer in the Balkans during the war, in a unit that was responsible for the deportation of Jews to concentration camps and the execution of civilian hostages. When journalists and researchers exposed his wartime record during the 1986 presidential campaign, Waldheim denied knowledge of war crimes, was elected anyway, and served a full term while being banned from entering the United States and several other countries. Austria's official acknowledgement of its co-responsibility for the Holocaust, rather than its status as a victim, did not come until the Vranitzky Declaration of 1991, when Chancellor Franz Vranitzky stated in the Austrian parliament that Austria bore a share of responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi era, and that this had been too long denied. The declaration was historically significant and politically courageous. It was also 46 years late. For those 46 years, Austrian institutions had systematically promoted a national narrative that exempted Austria from accountability, that allowed former perpetrators to live without social stigma, and that made Austrian memory of the Holocaust almost entirely about Austrian Jewish suffering without acknowledgement of Austrian non-Jewish perpetration. Proportionally, Austrians were significantly overrepresented among the senior perpetrators of the Holocaust relative to their share of the German-Austrian population. Adolf Eichmann was Austrian. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was Austrian. Odilo Globoknik was Austrian. Franz Stangl was Austrian. Alois Brunner was Austrian. Adolf Hitler was Austrian. The country that produced a disproportionate share of the architects of the Holocaust spent nearly half a century officially characterizing itself as the first victim of the Holocaust's author. The political consequences of this narrative, for Austrian collective memory, for the treatment of survivors, for Holocaust education, were significant and are not yet fully resolved. Truth 9. The Allied governments knew about the death camps years before liberation. In August 1942, Gerhard Riegner, the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Geneva, sent a telegram to the British Foreign Office and the American State Department reporting that he had received information from a well-placed German source that the Nazi government was planning to exterminate at one blow all European Jews. The telegram, which became known as the Riegner telegram, was based on information from Eduard Schult, a German industrialist with connections to the Nazi leadership who had become aware of the plan at the highest levels of decision-making. The British Foreign Office received it and filed it. The American State Department received it and, in a decision that was later formally investigated and found to be deliberate obstruction, suppressed it from reaching its intended recipient, Rabbi Stephen Wise of the American Jewish Congress. This was not the first information the Allies had received about the systematic murder of Jews in occupied Europe. The British had been reading decrypted German police messages since the summer of 1941, messages that included the kill count reports of the Einsatzgruppen, reporting the murders of thousands, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of Jews in the occupied Soviet territories. By September 1941, Churchill had publicly referred to a crime without a name. The British government knew, from its own intelligence sources, what was happening, and classified that knowledge because its source, the Enigma decrypts, could not be revealed without compromising the entire intelligence program. By 1943, the Allied governments had received detailed reports from the Polish government in exile, from Jewish organizations, from neutral sources, and from their own intelligence services. The existence of Auschwitz-Birkenau as an extermination facility was known. The function of the death camps was known. Requests for specific military action, bombing the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, bombing the gas chambers themselves, were made by Jewish organizations and by the War Refugee Board, established by Roosevelt in 1944 under Treasury Department pressure. They were refused. The official position of both the British and American governments was that the best way to help the victims was to win the war as quickly as possible, and that any diversion of military resources to rescue efforts would delay that outcome. This argument has been debated by historians ever since, with serious scholars on both sides of the question of whether bombing the Auschwitz rail lines was militarily feasible and strategically sensible given the broader context of the air campaign in 1944. What is not debated is the basic fact that the Allied governments received specific, credible, accurate information about the systematic murder of European Jews and made a series of deliberate decisions not to act on it in any way that might interrupt the killing. The Hungarian deportations of 1944, which killed approximately 437,000 people between May and July, while Allied aircraft were flying missions in the region, are the clearest case. The rail lines were not bombed. The crematoria were not bombed. The killing continued at full pace until Horthy suspended the deportations under international pressure in early July. Truth 10. The Eichmann trial was almost blocked by West Germany. When Israeli Mossad agents abducted Adolf Eichmann from a street corner in Buenos Aires in May 1960, the diplomatic consequences were immediate and significant. Argentina, which had provided a home to many former Nazis and whose government included individuals sympathetic to them, lodged a formal protest with the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council passed a resolution censuring Israel for the violation of Argentine sovereignty. The United States expressed concern about the precedent of state-sponsored abduction from a third country. These were expected reactions. What is less well known is the internal West German response, which reflected the profound ambivalence of a government staffed significantly by former Nazis toward the prospect of a public trial of one of the Holocaust's principal administrators. West Germany's primary concern was not Eichmann himself, but what his trial would reveal about the networks that had helped him escape, the employers who had sheltered him under false identity, and the colleagues who had gone on to careers in the West German government and business world. Eichmann had not operated alone. He had operated within an organization whose alumni were, in 1960, distributed across respectable West German institutions. A full public trial, with Eichmann providing detailed testimony about the operations he had managed and the colleagues he had worked with, was a potential catastrophe for the West German political establishment. West Germany argued, through diplomatic channels, that Eichmann should be tried in West Germany rather than Israel, a position that, if accepted, would have placed the trial in a legal system staffed significantly by former Nazis, before judges who had in some cases served the Nazi legal system, in a political environment where the government had a direct institutional interest in limiting the scope of revelations. The argument was rejected by Israel, which proceeded with the trial in Jerusalem. The Eichmann trial, conducted between April and December 1961, was transformative for Holocaust memory in ways that historians have consistently identified as the single most important shift in public awareness of the Holocaust in the post-war era. The testimony of survivors, presented in a formal legal context, broadcast internationally, heard by a global audience, made the Holocaust human reality concrete and specific in a way that no previous public discourse had achieved. The trial was, in the judgment of historians like Deborah Lipstadt, the moment when the Holocaust became part of global public consciousness rather than a subject confined to Jewish communities and specialist historians. Eichmann himself, in his testimony, confirmed everything that Arendt and other observers found most disturbing. He was not a monster. He was a bureaucrat. He described his work in the language of professional obligation. He expressed no remorse. He claimed repeatedly that he had simply been following orders, an argument that the court, applying the Nuremberg precedent, rejected entirely. He was convicted and hanged. In the trial his former colleagues had worked to prevent in West Germany went on to produce exactly the public reckoning they had feared, triggering the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 and a generational shift in German public discourse about the Nazi past. Truth 11. France officially denied Vichy collaboration until Chirac's 1995 speech. For 50 years after the liberation of France, the official French national narrative of the Second World War was built on a foundational fiction: that France had been a nation of resistors, that the Vichy government represented a small collaborationist minority imposed on the French people by German occupation, and that France, the France of de Gaulle and the Free French, the France of Jean Moulin and the Maquis, had remained true to its republican values throughout the dark years. This narrative was politically necessary in 1944. It became politically convenient thereafter, and it was maintained with remarkable persistence by French governments across the entire political spectrum until it collapsed under the weight of historical evidence and political courage in 1995. The reality of Vichy France is considerably more complex and considerably more damning than the resistance myth allowed. The Vichy government was not merely a puppet of German occupation. It was a functioning French state with its own legal system, its own administrative apparatus, its own political ideology, a reactionary, anti-republican, anti-Semitic nationalism that predated the German occupation and would have found expression in some form even without it. Vichy passed its own anti-Jewish legislation in October 1940, before the Germans required it. The Statut des Juifs stripped French Jews of citizenship and excluded them from public life, the professions, and the military on Vichy's own initiative. The Vel d'Hiv roundup of July 1942, in which French police arrested approximately 13,000 Jews in Paris, including 4,000 children, and held them in the Velodrome d'Hiv recycling stadium before deportation to Auschwitz, was organized and executed by French police on orders from French authorities, with French administrative efficiency. The Germans had not specifically requested the inclusion of children. French officials included them to avoid the administrative inconvenience of managing orphaned Jewish children after their parents had been deported. The logical conclusion of French bureaucratic thoroughness was the murder of 4,000 children. The French historian Henri Rousseau documented the process by which France maintained its resistance mythology across the post-war decades, what he called the Vichy syndrome, in a landmark 1987 study. The syndrome included the systematic suppression of films, books, and historical accounts that challenged the mythology, the reluctance of French courts to try Vichy-era crimes, and the political impossibility of any French president acknowledging Vichy as a French rather than an imposed German phenomenon. President de Gaulle had made the political decision that France could not be rebuilt as a unified nation if it was required to confront the reality of its wartime choices. His successors maintained the same position. It was Jacques Chirac who finally broke the pattern. In a speech at the Vel d'Hiv commemoration in July 1995, stating directly, "France, the homeland of the Enlightenment and of the rights of man, a land of welcome and asylum, France, on that day, committed the irreparable." The speech was historic. It was also 50 years overdue. In those 50 years, the survivors of Vichy persecution had grown old. The perpetrators had lived without consequence. The national memory had been deliberately falsified, and the political legitimacy of far-right movements in France, movements that used the mythology of a unified Vichy France as one of their historical anchors, had been sustained partly by the official refusal to name what Vichy actually was. Truth 12. Post-war Poland saw organized violence against Holocaust survivors. On July 4, 1946, more than a year after the liberation of the Nazi death camps, a mob attacked the building at Planny Street 7 in Kielce, Poland, which housed approximately 180 Jewish survivors who had returned to the city after surviving the Holocaust. The mob, which included Polish civilians, members of the Polish Citizens Militia, and soldiers of the Polish Army, killed 42 of the survivors and wounded approximately 40 more. The attack was triggered by a false rumor, of the kind that had driven pogroms for centuries, that Jews in the building were holding a Christian child captive for ritual murder purposes. The rumor was false. The violence was real. And it was not an isolated incident. The Kielce pogrom was the deadliest single act of anti-Jewish violence in post-war Poland, but it was part of a broader pattern. The historian Jan Gross, in his 2006 study Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, documented approximately 1,500 murders of Jews in Poland between liberation in 1945 and the Kielce pogrom in 1946. These were Jews who had survived the Nazi extermination program, who had survived labor camps or hiding or the forests, who had survived the death marches, and who returned to their pre-war homes to find that not only had those homes been taken over by Polish neighbors, but that their survival itself was, in some communities, regarded as unwelcome. The economic dimension of this violence is crucial to understanding it. During the German occupation, the property of murdered Polish Jews, their homes, their businesses, their furnishings, their books, had been taken over by Polish neighbors, sometimes through purchase at distressed prices, sometimes simply by moving in after the deportations. The return of survivors created a threat, in the minds of those who had benefited from their absence, to the property arrangements that had been established. Violence against returning survivors served the economic interest of those who had taken their possessions. The blood libel rumors that triggered attacks like Kielce were the ideological packaging around an economic motive. The Polish government's response to the Kielce pogrom was swift in certain respects. Arrests were made, trials were held, several perpetrators were executed, but the underlying climate that had made the pogrom possible was not addressed. The communist government that ruled Poland had its own complicated relationship with a history of Polish anti-Semitism. The full historical reckoning with Polish behavior toward Jews during the Holocaust, including the role of some Poles in denouncing hiding Jews to German authorities, in participating in local massacres, and in taking over Jewish property, remained politically impossible in Poland until the publication of Jan Gross's Neighbors in 2001, which documented the Jedwab massacre of 1941, in which Polish civilians murdered approximately 340 Jews by locking them in a barn and burning it down. Truth 13. The Soviet Union suppressed Holocaust memory for 40 years. The Soviet Union liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, a date now commemorated internationally as Holocaust Remembrance Day. Soviet forces were the first to see the physical reality of an extermination complex in full operational detail. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the warehouses of shoes and hair and personal effects, the approximately 7,000 surviving prisoners who had been left behind when the SS retreated. Soviet photographers and cameramen documented what they found. Soviet military reports described it. And then, for the better part of 40 years, the Soviet states systematically suppressed the specifically Jewish character of what had happened there. The suppression was ideological. Soviet doctrine described the victims of Nazi Germany as Soviet citizens or peaceful citizens, a categorization that was technically accurate for some victims and deliberately obscuring for others. Jewish victimhood as a specific category was de-emphasized in official Soviet commemoration, in museum displays, in school curricula, and in public memorials. At Babi Yar, the ravine outside Kyiv where approximately 33,771 Jews were murdered in September 1941 in what remains the single largest two-day massacre of the Holocaust, a Soviet monument erected in 1976 referred to Soviet citizens killed by German fascists without mentioning that the victims were Jewish. Yevgeny Yevtushenko's 1961 poem, Babi Yar, which opened with the line "No monument stands over Babi Yar," and named the victims explicitly as Jews, was a political statement of considerable courage in the Soviet context. Ilya Ehrenburg and Vasily Grossman compiled The Black Book, a comprehensive documentary account of Nazi crimes against Jews on Soviet territory, based on testimonies, documents, and on-site investigation during the war years. It was ready for publication in 1946. Soviet authorities blocked its publication. The manuscript was confiscated. It was not published in the Soviet Union until 1993. A version was published in English in 1981. The suppression of the Black Book was part of a broader Soviet pattern. The anti-cosmopolitan campaign of the late Stalin years explicitly targeted Jewish cultural institutions, intellectuals, and a memory of specifically Jewish victimhood as ideologically inconvenient. The consequence of 40 years of Soviet suppression of Holocaust memory was not merely a gap in public knowledge in the USSR and its satellite states. It created the conditions for a particular form of historical revision in the post-Soviet space that persists to the present day. The conflation of Soviet and Jewish victimhood in ways that obscure the specifically anti-Semitic targeting of Jews, the rehabilitation of nationalist figures in the Baltic states and Ukraine whose wartime records included participation in the Holocaust, and the political use of World War II memory in ways that are simultaneously sincere and selectively amnesiac. About Jewish victimhood. Truth 14. The Bermuda Conference was deliberately designed to accomplish nothing. In April 1943, while the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was burning and the extermination camps were operating at peak capacity, the United States and Great Britain held a 12-day conference in Bermuda nominally devoted to the problem of Jewish refugees in Europe. The conference was held in Bermuda, specifically because its remoteness made attendance by Jewish organizations or press observers difficult. Its proceedings were classified, specifically because the governments did not want the public to know what they were actually discussing. Its agenda was predetermined, specifically because both governments had agreed in advance that there would be no significant change in immigration policy, no rescue commitments, and no specific measures to interrupt the killing operations. The internal documentation of the conference, which was declassified after the war, reveals an exercise in diplomatic theater of extraordinary cynicism. American and British officials agreed before the conference that they would not discuss the specific situation of Jews, framing the agenda as being about refugees generally to avoid the politically uncomfortable acknowledgement that there was a specific population being actively murdered. They agreed not to discuss Palestine as a refugee destination because Britain was committed to limiting Jewish immigration there. They agreed not to discuss changes to immigration quotas because both governments were unwilling to increase them. They discussed at length the problem of what to do with refugees who were already safe, people who had already escaped, while doing nothing about the people who were still being killed. The Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long, who was primarily responsible for American refugee policy during this period, and who had earlier issued a memorandum explaining how to use administrative procedures to keep Jewish refugees out of the United States, represented the American position. Long was later found, in a congressional investigation, to have systematically overstated the number of Jewish refugees admitted to the United States and to have used bureaucratic mechanisms specifically designed to frustrate the legal immigration of Jews fleeing persecution. He did this while publicly describing himself as a humanitarian dedicated to helping refugees. The Bermuda Conference produced a joint communiqué describing its work in optimistic terms that bore no relationship to what had actually been agreed. The conference was criticized immediately by Jewish organizations and humanitarian groups who had been excluded from it and who understood, from the absence of any concrete commitments, what it actually represented. Rabbi Stephen Wise, who had worked for years to bring the reality of the final solution to American public attention, described the conference as a mockery. He was right. In the period between the convening of the Bermuda Conference and the liberation of the camps 2 years later, approximately 2 million more Jews were murdered in the extermination camps. Truth 15. Holocaust denial follows specific, predictable, documented patterns. Holocaust denial is not a random collection of historical skepticism. It is a specific ideological project with identifiable arguments, predictable patterns, and documented origins. The historian Deborah Lipstadt, whose 1993 book, Denying the Holocaust, led to the most significant libel trial in the history of Holocaust scholarship, the Irving versus Penguin Books trial of 2000, in which the historian David Irving sued her for calling him a Holocaust denier, and lost comprehensively when the historical evidence of his deliberate manipulation of the historical record was laid out in court. identified the core methodology of denial with a precision that has not been improved upon in the 30 years since. Holocaust denial operates through a set of interlocking strategies that are designed not to engage with historical evidence, but to manufacture the appearance of legitimate historical debate. The core claims are that the number of Jewish victims has been vastly exaggerated, that there were no gas chambers or that they were used only for delousing, that Hitler did not order the Holocaust, and that there is no written order, that the documentary record has been fabricated or misinterpreted, and that the Holocaust narrative serves Jewish political interests. Each of these claims is false, and each has been comprehensively refuted by the documentary evidence. But denial is not about truth. It is about doubt. The no written order argument is a case study in how denial works. It is technically accurate that no signed Hitler order explicitly using the words "exterminate the Jews" has been found in the historical record. Denial uses this technical fact to suggest that Hitler was not responsible for the Holocaust. The historical scholarship responds that the documentary record is full of euphemistic orders that contemporaries understood to mean extermination, that the Wannsee Protocol, which explicitly coordinated the administrative machinery of the Holocaust, was found in a single copy and presumably existed in others that were destroyed, and that a totalitarian state in which explicit written orders for atrocities created criminal liability typically operated through oral instructions and understood mandates at the highest levels. The argument from silence about a specific document form is not historical evidence. It is manufactured doubt. The revisionism framing, which deniers use to describe their work, borrowing a term from legitimate historical practice, is designed to create the appearance that denial is simply one point of view in an ongoing historical debate. It is not. Historical revisionism is the practice of re-examining historical events in light of new evidence or new analytical frameworks. Holocaust denial begins with the conclusion that the Holocaust did not happen in the form the historical record describes, and works backward to select, distort, or dismiss evidence to support that conclusion. This is not revisionism. It is advocacy. Lipstadt's great contribution was to insist against a cultural tendency to treat all historical claims as equally debatable, that not all claims are equally supported by evidence, and that some claims are simply false. Truth 16. Modern far-right movements use Holocaust denial as a radicalization gateway. Researchers who study the process by which individuals move from ordinary political conservatism to extremist violence have consistently identified Holocaust denial as a significant element of the radicalization pathway. The logic is not simply that Holocaust deniers are more likely to be violent, though the data supports this correlation, but that Holocaust denial serves a specific function in the ideological architecture of the far right. It removes the historical example that serves as the most powerful counterargument to ethno-nationalist ideology. If the Holocaust did not happen, or happened in a dramatically different form than the historical record describes, then the most comprehensive evidence of where racial nationalism leads is eliminated. The warning in the history is erased along with the history. The Great Replacement theory, which holds that there is a deliberate plan to replace white European populations with non-white immigrants, driven by Jewish interests, is perhaps the most consequential contemporary far-right ideology in terms of its direct link to mass violence. The theory, popularized by the French author Renaud Camus in a 2011 book, has been cited as the ideological motivation by perpetrators of some of the most significant far-right terrorist attacks of the past decade, including the Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand in 2019, the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue shooting in 2018, and the Buffalo supermarket shooting in 2022. The shooter manifestos in several of these attacks explicitly reference the Great Replacement and combined it with Holocaust denial, denying the historical genocide of Jews while advancing an ideology that framed Jewish people as the architects of a contemporary genocidal project against white Europeans. The Tree of Life shooting, in which 11 Jewish worshippers were killed at a Pittsburgh synagogue on October 27, 2018, the largest anti-Semitic attack in American history, was carried out by a man who had been radicalized through online spaces where Holocaust denial content was freely available and where the Great Replacement theory was treated as established fact. The shooter's online postings made clear that his ideology combined denial of the historical Holocaust with the conviction that a contemporary replacement was underway and that violence was the appropriate response. This is not an isolated case. It is a pattern documented across numerous attacks. The radicalization pipeline, from mainstream conservative political engagement to nationalist forums to explicitly denial-centered communities to violence, has been mapped by researchers and documented in extensive case studies. The specific role of Holocaust denial in this pipeline is to provide ideological permission. If the worst thing that ever happened was a fabrication, then the people who are said to have fabricated it are enemies of truth, enemies of the white nations, and legitimate targets. Denial is not the endpoint of the radicalization process. It is a way station that makes the endpoint easier to reach. Truth 17. Only 4.8 million of the 6 million Jewish victims have been individually named. Yad Vashem, the Israeli National Holocaust Memorial and Research Institution, established by the Knesset in 1953, has been engaged since its founding in the recovery of the individual identities of Holocaust victims. The institution's central database of Shoah victims' names contains, as of the most recent published figures, approximately 4.8 million individual names, each one a specific person with a face and a history and a family, recovered from testimony pages submitted by survivors and relatives, from communal records, from Nazi documentation, from memorial books compiled by the remnants of destroyed communities, and from any other source that preserved the fact of a specific person's existence. 1.2 million names remain unrecovered. These are people who disappeared so completely, whose communities were so totally destroyed, whose families were so comprehensively murdered, whose records were so thoroughly erased, that no evidence of their individual existence has been found that would allow them to be entered into the database as specific people. They remain part of the number. They are counted as victims, but they cannot be named. They cannot be mourned individually. They exist in the historical record as an absence rather than a presence. The majority of the unrecovered 1.2 million are believed to be from communities in the Soviet Union, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, where the Einsatz grew up and killed entire villages in a matter of hours, where communal records were destroyed, where survivor populations were small or non-existent, and where the Soviet suppression of Holocaust memory for 40 years meant that the work of recovery was not undertaken during the period when it might have been most productive. The killing operations in these regions were so fast and so total that there was often no one left to testify to who had been there. Yad Vashem continues to collect testimony pages and to process records from newly accessible archives in the former Soviet states. The database grows, slowly, with each new submission. The goal, to recover every name, is acknowledged to be unachievable. There will always be victims who are known only as part of the number. The act of attempting the recovery anyway, of treating each individual identity as worth the institutional effort of finding and recording, is itself a form of moral resistance to what the Nazis attempted, the total erasure of a people, in which not only lives but memories of lives would be destroyed. Truth 18. The physical evidence of the Holocaust is actively deteriorating. The Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp complex, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1979, is deteriorating. The wooden barracks at Birkenau, constructed in the early 1940s from prefabricated horse stable sections that were never intended to stand for 80 years, are structurally compromised. The ruins of the gas chambers and crematoria, blown up by the retreating SS in January 1945, are eroding. The miles of barbed wire, the watchtowers, the railway tracks, the platform where the selections took place, all of it is subject to the ordinary processes of weathering, decay, and time that no preservation effort can fully arrest. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum has been conducting ongoing preservation work for decades, supported by the Polish government and by international donations, including a significant contribution from the German government. The most intensive current project is the conservation of the evidence room, the display of approximately 100,000 shoes belonging to victims, arranged in a vast pile behind glass. That is one of the most viscerally affecting exhibits in the museum. The shoes are disintegrating. The leather is cracking and fragmenting. The conservation challenge is extraordinary and may ultimately be insurmountable for all of them. The deterioration of physical evidence matters because physical evidence performs a different function than documentary evidence. Documents can be photographed, digitized, reproduced indefinitely. The physical artifacts of the Holocaust, the shoes, the hair, the suitcases with names written on them, the ruins of the gas chambers, the soil that still tests positive for the chemical residue of Zyklon B, cannot be reproduced. They are, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable. When they are gone, the material connection to the event, the possibility of standing in a specific place and having the physical reality of what happened there be present and immediate, will be gone with them. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Sobibor in recent years have mapped the underground remains of the camp's infrastructure, the buried foundations of buildings, the subsurface traces of the mass graves, with precision that allows the physical extent of the killing to be understood even in the absence of standing structures. The research has produced significant new information about the camp's layout and the scale of its operations. It has also demonstrated the fragility of this underground evidence. The remains are subject to agricultural activity, soil movement, and groundwater changes that are gradually erasing the physical record. In a few decades, even this evidence will be gone. Truth 19. The last witnesses are dying, and what happens after living memory is gone. The youngest survivors of the Holocaust who retain clear memories of the camps and the killing operations are now in their late 70s at minimum, and most are considerably older. The generation of survivors who testified at the Nuremberg trials, who gave evidence at the Eichmann trial, who built the survivor organizations and the memorial institutions and the testimony archives, that generation is almost entirely gone. What remains is the oldest fringe, people who were very young children during the war and whose memories are fragmentary, and a small number who were adolescents or young adults and whose memories remain vivid, but whose bodies are failing. The USC Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg following the production of Schindler's List, has recorded approximately 55,000 testimonies of Holocaust survivors, conducted in 43 languages in 65 countries. These testimonies, archived and indexed with sophisticated search capability, represent the most comprehensive collection of survivor testimony ever assembled. They are not, however, a substitute for living testimony. A recorded testimony can be watched. A living witness can be questioned, can respond to the specific concerns of a specific audience, can be present in a room, and can be seen and heard as a living person whose existence is itself evidence that what they describe happened. The transition from living memory to recorded memory is a documented shift in the social function of Holocaust remembrance. Research on the educational impact of Holocaust education finds that survivor testimony, delivered in person, has the most significant and most durable impact on the attitudes and knowledge of young people. The shift to recorded testimony, to second-generation witness programs where the children of survivors speak on behalf of their parents, and ultimately to fully mediated forms of remembrance, changes the relationship between the audience and the history in ways that are not yet fully understood. What we do know, from the historical precedent of other genocides and other atrocities, is that the period immediately following the end of living memory is typically one of heightened vulnerability to denial and revision. The people who can say, "I was there, I saw it, this happened," are gone. The claims of those who say it did not happen as described can no longer be directly confronted by the testimony of living witnesses. The institutional frameworks, the memorials, the archives, the laws against denial, the educational curricula that have been built to carry the memory forward are not tested until the living memory they supplement is gone. We are approaching that test. It is given the contemporary political climate in which Holocaust denial and minimization are demonstrably growing, a test that deserves serious preparation. Truth 20. The Nuremberg Code, created in response to Holocaust experiments, is being eroded. The Nuremberg Code, the 10-point set of ethical principles governing medical research on human subjects, established by the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1947, was written in direct response to the medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners by SS physicians, including Joseph Mengele, Karl Brandt, and dozens of others. The experiments, which included high-altitude pressure experiments that killed subjects, freezing experiments, malaria infection, sulfanilamide wound experiments, bone transplantation experiments, sterilization experiments, and many others, were conducted without consent, without anesthesia, and without any therapeutic purpose for the subjects. They were torture dressed in the language of science. The Nuremberg Code's central principle is informed, voluntary consent. No medical experiment may be conducted on a human being without that person's voluntary, informed, and legally competent agreement. This principle, which seems self-evident, was not universally practiced in medicine before Nuremberg. Various forms of non-consensual research had been conducted by respected medical institutions in multiple countries, including the United States, and its establishment as an explicit ethical requirement in the post-war period was a direct consequence of the Holocaust exposure of what medicine without ethics could produce. The code was supplemented by the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 and is embedded in the regulatory frameworks of medical research in most countries. But bioethicists have documented, over the past several decades, significant pressure on the code's principles, particularly the informed consent requirement, from commercial pharmaceutical research conducted in developing countries, from debates about research in emergency medicine, where consent is impractical, and from more recent controversies about the terms under which research is conducted on vulnerable populations. The broader principle at stake, that there are ethical limits on what can be done to human beings in the name of scientific progress, that these limits cannot be waived by institutional authority or national emergency, and that the violation of these limits constitutes a crime against humanity, is not merely a historical principle. It is a living principle with active relevance to medical research, to national security detention practices, to the treatment of prisoners, and to any context in which institutions claim authority over the bodies of individuals who have not consented to that authority. The Nuremberg Code is not a museum exhibit. It is a boundary drawn in response to specific historical events. The reasons for that boundary remain current. Truth 21. Social media algorithms have created the largest amplification system for Holocaust denial in history. The most significant change in the social environment of Holocaust denial in the past decade is not ideological. It is technological. The social media platforms that emerged in the 2000s and achieved mass adoption in the 2010s were built on engagement maximization algorithms, recommendation systems designed to show users content that keeps them on the platform longer, because longer engagement translates to more advertising revenue. These algorithms do not distinguish between true and false content, between historically accurate and historically fraudulent claims, between educational Holocaust content and Holocaust denial. They optimize for engagement. Denial content, which typically carries a strong emotional charge, the satisfaction of believing one knows a suppressed truth, the excitement of transgression, the tribal affirmation of a group identity built around shared belief that mainstream institutions are lying, generates high engagement. A 2021 study by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue found that Holocaust denial content on Facebook, which had been present on the platform for years without meaningful enforcement action, had been actively recommended to users who engaged with related historical content. Users who watched or interacted with content about the Second World War were, in a documented proportion of cases, subsequently recommended Holocaust denial content by the platform's recommendation algorithm. The algorithm was not promoting denial because it was ideologically sympathetic to it. It was promoting it because users who engaged with it continued engaging, and continued engagement was the metric the algorithm was designed to maximize. The scale of the amplification is historically unprecedented. The Nazi propaganda apparatus of the 1930s and 1940s, which was the most advanced state propaganda system that had existed to that point, could reach the population of Germany and the occupied territories. A social media platform in 2024 can reach 3 billion users. Holocaust denial content that in 1990 would have required a significant publishing and distribution operation to reach a few thousand people can now, if it achieves algorithmic amplification, reach millions in days. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the anti-Semitic forgery that circulated as a book through physical distribution for a century, is now available on every platform and has been viewed by audiences that would have been unimaginable to its original distributors. The platform's responses to this problem have been inconsistent, partial, and frequently driven by commercial considerations rather than ethical ones. Facebook did not ban Holocaust denial content until October 2020, after years of pressure from Jewish organizations, researchers, and governments, and its enforcement of the ban has been incomplete. YouTube's response to denial content has similarly been inconsistent. Twitter/X, under its current ownership, has substantially reduced the enforcement mechanisms that had previously limited some categories of hateful content. The practical consequence is that the largest communication platforms in history remain environments in which Holocaust denial is accessible, often algorithmically recommended, and in some cases specifically amplified. Truth 22. The Great Replacement theory has direct roots in Nazi racial ideology. The Great Replacement theory, which holds that non-white immigration to Western countries is a deliberate plan to replace white European populations, orchestrated by Jewish interests for political and demographic advantage, is not a new idea with contemporary origins. It is a modification of Nazi racial ideology that substitutes the language of replacement for the language of Aryanization, while maintaining the fundamental structure of the Nazi worldview. There is a racial struggle between white Europeans and Jews. Jews are engineering the destruction of white European civilization through demographic manipulation, and the appropriate response is resistance, by whatever means necessary. The Nazi concept of Volksstaat, the death of a people, described the feared demographic extinction of the German race through racial mixing and Jewish influence. The concept of Entvolkung, depopulation of the true German stock, was used in Nazi policy discussions about occupied territories, where the goal was to replace existing populations with German settlers. The language has changed. The structure is identical. Contemporary Great Replacement advocates who claim they are advancing a new political theory are, in most cases, either unaware of or deliberately obscuring the theory's genealogy. The specific argument that Jewish people are orchestrating demographic replacement is the element that connects Great Replacement theory most directly to the Holocaust's ideological foundations. Nazi racial ideology identified Jews as an existential threat, not merely because of religious or cultural difference, but because of their alleged role as agents of racial destruction, promoting internationalism, immigration, and racial mixing to weaken and ultimately destroy the Germanic people. The Great Replacement theory advances the same argument in contemporary language, targeting immigration and demographic change rather than racial mixing specifically, but maintaining the identification of Jewish people as the manipulators behind the policy. The consequences of this ideological continuity have been demonstrably lethal. The perpetrators of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the Christchurch mosque attack, the El Paso Walmart shooting, and the Buffalo supermarket shooting all left behind documents that articulated versions of Great Replacement theory and identified Jewish people as responsible for the demographic changes they were opposing. These were not coincidental connections. They were the logical conclusion of an ideology that has direct roots in the most lethal anti-Semitic ideology in history. Teaching the Holocaust's ideological foundations is not merely historical education. It is counterterrorism education. Truth 23. Lithuania and Baltic states have partially rehabilitated Holocaust collaborators as national heroes. In the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which were occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940, then by Nazi Germany from 1941, then by the Soviet Union again from 1944. The politics of historical memory after independence in 1991 produced a specific and deeply problematic pattern: the rehabilitation of figures who had collaborated with the Nazi occupation as national heroes, because those same figures had also resisted Soviet occupation. The logic of enemy of my enemy produced commemorations, street names, monuments, and official recognition for individuals whose wartime records included direct participation in the murder of Jews. In Lithuania, the Lithuanian Activist Front, which organized an anti-Soviet uprising in June 1941 and declared a provisional government at the moment of German invasion, also organized and participated in the murder of Jewish Lithuanians in the days before German forces arrived in Kaunas and other cities. The pogrom at the Liatukis garage in Kaunas, in which approximately 50 Jewish men were beaten to death in front of crowds of civilian spectators on June 25 and 26, 1941, was carried out by Lithuanian nationalists. The subsequent mass shootings at the 7th Fort and the 9th Fort in Kaunas, which killed tens of thousands of Jewish Lithuanians, involved significant Lithuanian collaboration. The political challenge for post-Soviet Lithuania was real. Soviet propaganda had deliberately conflated Lithuanian nationalism with fascism, and the restoration of Lithuanian national identity required reaffirming the legitimacy of the independence movement. But the reaffirmation of national identity should not require the rehabilitation of individuals who participated in genocide. The distinction between resisting Soviet occupation, which was legitimate, and murdering Jewish civilians, which was a crime, is not a difficult distinction to make. The difficulty is political. In small countries where the nationalist movement draws on a limited pool of historical heroes, acknowledging the crimes of those heroes requires either accepting a more complex and less heroic national narrative or whitewashing the crimes. The Simon Wiesenthal Center has consistently documented the failure of Baltic justice systems to prosecute Holocaust perpetrators, the rehabilitation of individuals with documented records of collaboration in atrocities, and the political pressure on researchers and institutions that attempt to bring accurate history to public attention. Ephraim Zuroff, the Wiesenthal Center's Israel director, has spent decades pursuing Baltic perpetrators through legal systems that have shown consistent reluctance to act. The intersection of Cold War memory, national identity politics, and Holocaust justice is one of the most unresolved areas of European historical reckoning. Truth 24. Hungary has partially rehabilitated Miklos Horthy despite his role in the Holocaust. Miklos Horthy served as regent of Hungary from 1920 to 1944. Under his leadership, Hungary passed anti-Semitic legislation in the 1920s and 1930s that predated the Nuremberg laws. Hungary allied itself with Nazi Germany. Hungarian forces participated in atrocities on the Eastern Front, and in 1944, following the German occupation of Hungary in March of that year, the Hungarian government and civil administration cooperated with Adolf Eichmann's deportation operation that sent 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 56 days. The cooperation of Hungarian authorities, including the Hungarian police and the Hungarian state railway system, was described by the historical record as active and essential to the operation's speed and scale. Horthy did intervene to stop the deportations in early July 1944, a decision that preserved the lives of the approximately 150,000 Jews of Budapest who had not yet been deported. This intervention is real and historically significant. It demonstrates that the deportations could have been resisted earlier, and that Horthy had more agency than he claimed in post-war testimony. The intervention came after international pressure from the Pope, from the King of Sweden, from President Roosevelt, and after it was clear that Germany was losing the war and that collaboration with genocide would have post-war consequences. It came when approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were already dead. The Viktor Orbán government, which has governed Hungary since 2010, has engaged in a gradual rehabilitation of Horthy as a Hungarian national figure, erecting statues, naming streets, and allowing or encouraging commemorations that present him as a patriot who protected Hungary from communism. This rehabilitation is occurring alongside rhetoric that Hungary's Jewish community and European institutions have identified as anti-Semitic, including the Orbán government's sustained campaign against George Soros, a Hungarian-born Jewish philanthropist, that uses imagery and language that echo historical anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish global manipulation. The rehabilitation of Horthy in contemporary Hungary is not merely a historical dispute about how to assess a complex historical figure. It is a political project that selectively recovers the aspects of Horthy's legacy useful to contemporary nationalism while minimizing the aspects, including his role in the largest deportation in the Holocaust history, that are incompatible with that project. The use of historical rehabilitation for contemporary political purposes in the country where 437,000 people were deported to Auschwitz within living memory of people who are still alive is a specific form of the relationship between Holocaust memory and contemporary politics that deserves direct attention. Truth 25. Poland's 2018 Holocaust law attempted to criminalize accurate historical description. In January 2018, the Polish government of the Law and Justice Party passed an amendment to the Act on the Institute of National Remembrance that made it a criminal offense, punishable by up to 3 years in prison, to publicly attribute to the Polish nation or the Polish state responsibility for crimes committed by the Third Reich. The law was immediately and sharply condemned by Israel, the United States, and historians internationally, including Yad Vashem, which issued an unusually direct statement describing the law as an attempt to use legislation to reshape historical reality. The controversy centered on a specific and well-documented historical problem. Some Poles participated in the persecution and murder of Jews during the German occupation of Poland, and some Polish institutions failed to protect Jewish Poles from that persecution. This is not a claim that Poles as a people or Poland as a state were responsible for the Holocaust. They were not. The Holocaust was a German project, implemented by German institutions and German decisions. But the claim that no Poles participated in Holocaust-related crimes is historically false, as the documented case of the Jedwab massacre, in which Polish civilians murdered their Jewish neighbors, and numerous other documented cases demonstrate. Yad Vashem's statement made this distinction clearly. There were those who risked their lives to save Jews, and there were also those who collaborated with the Germans, informed on Jews, and murdered Jews. Polish rescuers of Jews deserve recognition and admiration, and their deeds must be remembered and honored. But it is also important that the crimes committed against Jews on the territory of occupied Poland not be whitewashed. The law, as written, could have been used to prosecute historians who accurately described Polish collaboration, including Polish Jewish historians, Israeli academics, and researchers whose published work included documented cases of Poles participating in anti-Jewish violence. Under significant international diplomatic pressure, the Polish government revised the law in June 2018, removing the criminal penalties and limiting its scope to civil proceedings. The episode nonetheless revealed the continuing political sensitivity of Holocaust memory in Poland, a country where approximately 3 million Jewish citizens were murdered, where the extermination camps were physically located, and where the question of Polish behavior toward Jews during the occupation remains a subject of political contention rather than established historical consensus. The law also revealed the specific danger of governments attempting to use criminal law to determine what historical conclusions are permissible, a danger that is not confined to Poland. Truth 26. Neo-Nazi groups have infiltrated law enforcement and military in multiple countries. In October 2006, the FBI released a report titled White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement that documented concerns about the presence of white supremacist and neo-Nazi individuals in American law enforcement agencies. The report noted that white supremacists were specifically encouraged by movement leadership to seek employment in law enforcement for the access it provided to databases, weapons, training, and information about ongoing investigations. The 2006 report was not the first such assessment. It was not the last. A 2020 investigation by journalist Michael German of the Brennan Center for Justice documented dozens of cases of active or recent law enforcement officials who had been found to have connections to white supremacist organizations, often involving social media activity that was either discovered accidentally or reported by colleagues. In Germany, the problem has been documented with even greater specificity. The Hannibal Network, a loose organization of far-right extremists with significant penetration of the German military's elite KSK commando unit, was revealed through investigative journalism in 2017 and 2018. KSK members were found to have stockpiled weapons and ammunition illegally, to have organized to resist what they described as an imminent collapse of social order, and to have maintained communication networks with known neo-Nazi figures. The German government's response included dissolving one KSK company and initiating significant institutional reforms, but subsequent investigations continued to find individual KSK members with far-right connections. The NSU, the National Socialist Underground, was a German neo-Nazi terrorist cell that carried out 10 murders, 2 bombings, and 14 bank robberies over a 13-year period from 1998 to 2011. The murders included 9 men of Turkish and Greek origin and a German police officer. The NSU operated for 13 years without being identified by German domestic intelligence services, despite multiple informants within the neo-Nazi milieu. The subsequent parliamentary investigation found that the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, Germany's domestic intelligence agency, had informants with direct connections to the NSU and had nonetheless failed to identify the cell or prevent the murders. Some files related to the case were shredded after the NSU's activities became public. The full extent of institutional failure, or worse, has never been fully established. The relevance to Holocaust history is direct. The Holocaust was implemented by institutional actors, police, military, civil servants, railway workers, who used their professional positions to carry out genocide. The presence of people committed to racial nationalism within the institutions that hold legitimate authority over force is not a new problem, and is not a problem that resolves itself. The institutional mechanisms, screening, monitoring, accountability structures, cultural norms, that are supposed to prevent this penetration depend on institutions taking the threat seriously. Where institutions fail to do so, the results, as the historical record demonstrates comprehensively, can be catastrophic. Truth 27. Reparations to Holocaust survivors are still being distributed and running out. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany. The Claims Conference, established in 1951, negotiates reparations with the German government on behalf of Holocaust survivors and their heirs, distributes payments to survivors, and funds Holocaust education and commemoration globally. The German government's commitment to ongoing reparations payments, which began under the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952 and have continued for more than 70 years, represents the most sustained program of state reparations in history. As of the most recent published figures, Germany has paid approximately 90 billion euros in total reparations since the program began, and continues to pay approximately 1 billion euros annually. The approximately 245,000 Holocaust survivors currently receiving payments from the Claims Conference are not the original generation of survivors. They are among the oldest surviving members of that generation, and their numbers decline each year as deaths outnumber new identifications. The Claims Conference has consistently worked to identify survivors who are not receiving payments they are entitled to, including survivors in the former Soviet states who were not eligible for earlier rounds of compensation and survivors whose eligibility was previously disputed. Each expansion of eligibility reaches fewer people because the population of survivors is diminishing. The financial situation of many Holocaust survivors globally is precarious. A 2019 Claims Conference survey found that approximately 1 in 3 Holocaust survivors worldwide lives at or near the poverty line. For survivors in the former Soviet states, where the reparations programs took longest to reach and where the economic systems do not provide the same social safety net as Western Europe, the proportion in financial hardship is higher. These are people in their 80s and 90s who survived genocide and who are now at risk of dying in poverty. Not because reparations have not been paid, but because the amounts are inadequate, the programs reach them late, and the structural disadvantages imposed by persecution compound across a lifetime. The question of reparations for the heirs of Holocaust victims, people whose parents or grandparents were murdered and whose inheritance was therefore stolen along with the lives of their family members, is a separate and still unresolved question in several countries. Property claims in Eastern Europe, where Jewish-owned real estate, businesses, and personal property were first confiscated by German occupation authorities and then nationalized by communist governments, remain incompletely addressed. Poland, notably, does not have a comprehensive private property restitution law for Holocaust-era property and has resisted international pressure to enact one. Truth 28. Holocaust memorial sites and cemeteries face escalating vandalism. The European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights conducts regular surveys of Jewish community members across EU member states on their experience of anti-Semitism. The most recent comprehensive survey found that the majority of Jewish respondents across almost all EU countries reported that anti-Semitism had increased over the past decade, that they had modified their behavior in public, avoiding identifying as Jewish because of safety concerns, and that they had considered emigrating from the country where they lived because of anti-Semitism. These are not hypothetical fears. They are behavioral responses to a documented and measurable increase in the frequency and severity of anti-Semitic incidents. Jewish cemeteries and memorial sites are among the most consistent targets of anti-Semitic vandalism across Europe and North America. The desecration of Jewish cemeteries, gravestones overturned or smashed, anti-Semitic graffiti painted on memorial walls, swastikas carved into commemorative stones, occurs at a frequency that the communities affected describe as no longer surprising. The Auschwitz Memorial has been vandalized multiple times. The Babi Yar Memorial in Kyiv has been vandalized. Jewish cemeteries in France, Germany, Poland, and the United States are vandalized at a documented rate that places them among the most frequently targeted religious sites in the respective countries. The significance of targeting Jewish cemeteries specifically is not merely that they are easy targets or that the vandals are expressing general hostility. Jewish cemeteries, in Jewish tradition, are permanent resting places. Bodies are not moved once buried, and the physical integrity of the burial site has sacred significance. Destroying a cemetery is an act directed not only at the living community, but at the dead. For Holocaust survivors and their families, many of whom have no grave to visit, whose relatives were murdered in ways that left no identifiable remains, the Jewish cemeteries that exist are often the only physical sites of mourning available. Their desecration is experienced as a continuation of the original violence. The escalating frequency of anti-Semitic incidents, which the ADL has documented as reaching record levels in the United States in multiple consecutive years, is occurring in a political environment that has also seen the mainstreaming of elements of the rhetoric that historically preceded anti-Semitic violence. The relationship between political rhetoric about Jewish influence, financial control, and demographic manipulation and the incidence of anti-Semitic violence is documented and causal, not merely correlational. The mechanisms are the same as those that operated in the 1930s. The scale is smaller. The recognition among policymakers of the seriousness of the trajectory has been uneven. Truth 29. The International Criminal Court, created partly from Holocaust justice, is under sustained attack. The International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute in 2002, is the direct institutional descendant of the legal principles established at Nuremberg, that there are crimes so severe, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, that no national government can provide immunity for those who commit them, and that an international legal institution has the authority and the obligation to prosecute them. The Nuremberg trials established the principle. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, established in the 1990s in response to the genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda, demonstrated that the principle could be institutionalized in specific contexts. The ICC was created to provide a permanent, standing institution with universal jurisdiction. The ICC has been under sustained political attack since its founding. The United States, which played a central role in establishing the Nuremberg tribunals and in negotiating the Rome Statute, ultimately did not ratify the statute under the George W. Bush administration, which expressed concern that the court could be used to prosecute American military personnel. The Trump administration went further, imposing sanctions on ICC officials, including the court's chief prosecutor, in 2020, in response to the court's investigation of alleged American war crimes in Afghanistan. The sanctions were lifted by the Biden administration, but the fundamental American ambivalence about an institution whose principles were established partly through American leadership remains. Russia and China, both permanent members of the UN Security Council and both countries with records of conduct that could fall within the ICC's jurisdiction, have not ratified the Rome Statute. Several African countries have withdrawn from or threatened to withdraw from the court, arguing that it disproportionately targets African leaders, while Western leaders with comparable records face no accountability. The political isolation of the ICC, occurring even as it has issued its most significant warrants, including the 2023 arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin in connection with the deportation of Ukrainian children, reflects the fundamental tension between the principle of universal accountability and the political reality of a world in which powerful states will not accept external accountability for their conduct. The attack on the ICC is relevant to Holocaust history not only because of the institutional genealogy, but because of the argument that sustains it. The argument that powerful states should not be subject to external legal accountability is the same argument that the Nazi legal system advanced, in its own terms, for the entirety of its existence. The Nuremberg principle, that no state authority can legitimize crimes against humanity, is precisely the principle that the ICC's opponents are, in their various ways, contesting. The historical stakes of this contest, given what happened the last time international accountability mechanisms failed to function, are high. Truth 30. The Never Again pledge has demonstrably failed. Subsequent genocides were not prevented. Never again is the phrase that emerged from the Holocaust's ashes as a collective human commitment, a declaration that the world had witnessed the most terrible consequence of unchecked genocidal ideology and that it would not allow it to happen again. The phrase is carved on memorial walls. It is spoken at commemorations. It is invoked in political speeches. It is used by governments, by institutions, by individuals across the world as an affirmation of shared human values. It is also, measured against the factual record of the decade since 1945, a promise that has been broken repeatedly, comprehensively, and in circumstances where the breaking was visible and documented in real time. The Cambodian genocide, in which the Khmer Rouge killed an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, approximately 25% of Cambodia's entire population, between 1975 and 1979, occurred while the international community watched and did not intervene militarily. The United States, still reeling from Vietnam, had no appetite for military engagement in Southeast Asia. China, which had supported the Khmer Rouge, vetoed international action. The genocide was ended not by international intervention, but by the Vietnamese military invasion of Cambodia in 1979. The Rwandan genocide of 1994, in which approximately 800,000 Tutsi Rwandans were killed in approximately 100 days, a rate of killing that exceeded even the Holocaust pace, occurred while United Nations peacekeeping troops were present in the country under a commander, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, who sent a detailed intelligence report to UN headquarters in January 1994 warning of the planned genocide and asking for authorization to act. The request was refused. The Clinton administration, which had the clearest intelligence picture of what was happening, made a deliberate decision not to use the word genocide publicly because doing so would have triggered legal obligations under the Genocide Convention. The killing continued for 100 days. The Srebrenica massacre of July 1995, in which approximately 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys were murdered by Bosnian Serb forces within a UN-designated safe area, while Dutch UN peacekeepers stood by, occurred within a broader Bosnian conflict in which the international community had been present and engaged for years. The genocide in Darfur, Sudan, which killed an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 people beginning in 2003, occurred as the Nuremberg Tribunal successors, the ad hoc international criminal tribunals, were sitting in The Hague. The Yazidi genocide in Iraq and Syria in 2014, in which ISIS committed acts against the Yazidi people that the UN formally recognized as genocide, occurred under the surveillance of every major intelligence service in the world. The conclusion is not that the Holocaust memorial institutions, the genocide scholars, the human rights lawyers, and the never again advocates have failed through insufficient effort. Many of them have worked with extraordinary commitment. The conclusion is that the political will to prevent genocide, which requires early identification, rapid multilateral response, the subordination of great power interests to humanitarian obligation, and the willingness to use military force in circumstances where doing so carries significant cost, has consistently failed to materialize at the moments when it was most needed. Never again, as a declaration, is not the same as never again, as a policy commitment with institutional support and political will behind it. Truth 31. Children of perpetrators and survivors still carry the Holocaust in their bodies. The Holocaust did not end with the liberation of the camps. For the survivors who walked out of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Mauthausen and the hundreds of other camps, and for those who survived in hiding, in the forests, in disguise, in flight, the liberation was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of a different chapter of a story that had no clean ending. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which was not recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980, and which the survivors of the Holocaust describe in terms that were largely dismissed by the medical establishment for decades, was effectively universal among survivors. Its symptoms, hypervigilance, flashbacks, emotional numbing, disrupted sleep, the inability to feel safe, shaped the lives of survivors and, as the research has increasingly demonstrated, the lives of their children. Rachel Yehuda, a neuroendocrinologist at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York, has conducted research over more than 2 decades into the intergenerational transmission of trauma in Holocaust survivor families. Her work has found measurable biological differences in stress hormone levels, in the regulation of the genes involved in stress response, between the children of Holocaust survivors and comparable control groups. The most controversial aspect of her research involves epigenetics, the finding that traumatic experience can alter gene expression in ways that are heritable, meaning that the biological effects of the Holocaust may have been transmitted directly from survivors to their children through mechanisms that are not yet fully understood. The implications of this research, if it is confirmed by the ongoing replication studies, are significant. They mean that the Holocaust consequences are not confined to the social and psychological effects of parenting under the shadow of unprocessed trauma, which are themselves well documented and substantial. They mean that the biological experience of extreme stress, starvation, terror, and loss may have been written into the bodies of the survivors in ways that were transmitted to their children before those children were born. The second generation of Holocaust survivors, the children born to survivors in the late 1940s and 1950s, are now reaching their 70s and 80s. The third generation is entering adulthood. The biological legacy of the Holocaust may be several generations from being resolved. And speaking of the children of perpetrators, the psychological literature on the families of Nazi perpetrators documents a different, but equally unresolved pattern. The children of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Haas, of Hans Frank, of other senior perpetrators, have in some cases spent their lives attempting to understand and account for what their parents did. Nicholas Frank, whose father governed occupied Poland, has been among the most unflinching public reckoners with a perpetrator parent. Others have taken the opposite path: denial, minimization, or simple silence. The families of perpetrators do not bear legal responsibility for what their relatives did, but they live in the long shadow of those acts, and how they choose to relate to that shadow is itself a moral question that the Holocaust poses to every generation that inherits its history. Truth 32. The financial infrastructure of the Holocaust was the most precisely documented in history, and that documentation has never been fully used for accountability. One of the most counterintuitive aspects of the Holocaust historical record is that the Germans documented their crimes with extraordinary precision. The operational reports of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units, file numerical tallies of victims with the regularity and format of routine administrative reports. The Wannsee Protocol, recording the coordination of the final solution across the German state apparatus, was preserved in a single copy and discovered after the war by Allied investigators. The camp records, intake documents, work assignments, medical records, death certificates, were maintained with bureaucratic thoroughness. The transportation records, train schedules, passenger manifests, billing documents from the Reichsbahn survived in archives that Allied investigators spent years processing. The financial records of the Holocaust are particularly detailed. The WVC, the SS Economic Administration under Oswald Pohl, maintained meticulous accounts of every transaction. The slave labor fees paid by corporations to the SS for prisoner labor, the gold delivered by the Reichsbank from the dental extractions of murder victims, the proceeds from the sale of victim clothing and personal effects, the charges billed to Jewish deportees for their own transportation to the death camps, third class, one-way fares, with a 50% discount for groups. Over 400. The documentation of the financial architecture of genocide is, in some respects, more complete than the documentation of the killing itself. The paradox is that this extraordinary documentation was used extensively in the Nuremberg trials, and then largely set aside as the political priorities of the Cold War shifted the focus of Western governments away from accountability and toward reconstruction. The corporate records that established IG Farben's knowing use of slave labor from Auschwitz were presented in court. The executives were convicted, and then, within a decade, those executives were free, their companies were reconstituted, and the financial systems that had profited from the Holocaust were fully integrated into the post-war Western economy, without any comprehensive accounting for what had happened. The full accounting of Holocaust-era assets, looted art, stolen property, dormant bank accounts, corporate profits from slave labor, has never been completed. The Washington Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art, agreed in 1998 by 44 countries, established voluntary guidelines for the restitution of looted art to its rightful owners or their heirs. Implementation has been inconsistent, contested, and heavily dependent on the willingness of individual museums and governments to conduct good faith provenance research. Thousands of works that were looted from Jewish families remain in museum collections that have not conducted the research required to determine their provenance. The financial legacy of the Holocaust remains unresolved, distributed through the financial systems of the world, and increasingly difficult to trace as the original transactions recede into history. Truth 33. The mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust are identifiable and recognizable today. Gregory Stanton, the founder of Genocide Watch, developed the 10 Stages of Genocide model, a framework for identifying the precursors and patterns of genocidal violence before it reaches its terminal phase. The model has been updated from its original 8 stages and identifies classification, distinguishing us from symbolization, naming and marking the targeted group; discrimination, legal exclusion of the group from the rights of citizenship; dehumanization, denial of the humanity of the targeted group through language and imagery; organization, the creation of genocidal militias and institutions; polarization, using propaganda to drive wedges between groups; preparation, identification and separation of the target group; persecution, confiscation of property; isolation, violence; extermination, the mass killing; and denial, the denial that any crime was committed. The Holocaust moved through all 10 stages with a clarity that makes it the definitive case study for the model. The Nuremberg laws were discrimination. The yellow star was symbolization. The Einsatzgruppen were organization. The deportations to camps were persecution and preparation. The gas chambers were extermination. And the denial began before the war was even over, as the SS attempted to destroy evidence in the final months of 1944 and early 1945, and continued in the post-war period in the forms we have examined throughout tonight's examination. The value of this analytical framework is not merely retrospective. It is diagnostic. When a government begins systematically classifying its population by ethnic or religious category, when that classification is used to assign different legal rights to different groups, when the targeted group is publicly dehumanized in media and political rhetoric, when organizations are built whose specific function is violence against the group, and when the state begins preparations, registers, identity documents, physical concentration in designated areas that have the effect of separating the target group from the protection of ordinary civil society, the model identifies those signs as precursors of potential genocide. The application of this framework to contemporary situations is contested, because every situation is different, because the application requires careful judgment about whether specific measures constitute precursors or something else, and because the Holocaust scale and systematic character make inappropriate comparisons an insult to its victims. But the refusal to apply any comparative analysis at all, out of respect for the Holocaust singularity, is itself a form of denying the Holocaust lessons. The Holocaust is singular in scale and systematic character. Its precursors and mechanisms are not singular. They are human, institutional, and therefore recognizable wherever the conditions that produce them are reproduced. Truth 34. Holocaust denial is legal in most of the world and growing in mainstream political discourse. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which produced the working definition of anti-Semitism adopted by more than 30 countries and numerous international institutions, has documented the growth of Holocaust denial and distortion in political discourse globally. 17 European countries, plus Israel, criminalize Holocaust denial in various forms, with laws that range from broad prohibitions on denial to more specific prohibitions on glorification or rehabilitation of Nazism. Outside Europe, Holocaust denial is almost universally legal. In the United States, the First Amendment's protections for speech make Holocaust denial law constitutionally impermissible in the same form as European prohibitions. The debate about whether criminalization of Holocaust denial is the appropriate policy response is genuine and serious. Proponents argue that denial is demonstrably harmful, that it is not a legitimate historical position, but a deliberate falsification, and that the harm it causes to survivors and Jewish communities is real and substantial. Opponents, including some Holocaust historians, argue that criminal prohibition creates martyrs, that it is ineffective against determined denial movements that simply move their operations online or to non-criminalizing jurisdictions, and that the appropriate response to false speech is true speech rather than criminal prohibition. What is not in dispute is that denial has moved from the fringe to a position that, in some political contexts, approaches the mainstream. Survey data from across Europe and North America finds significant minorities, in some countries, majorities in younger age cohorts, who are uncertain about or skeptical of basic facts about the Holocaust. A 2020 survey commissioned by the Claims Conference found that 63% of American millennials and Generation Z adults did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. 48% could not name a single concentration camp or ghetto. This is not Holocaust denial in the ideological sense, but it is a form of ignorance that creates the conditions in which denial can operate. The mainstreaming of denial-adjacent rhetoric in political discourse, references to globalist conspiracies, to controlled media and financial systems, to demographic replacement, represents a different and perhaps more dangerous phenomenon than explicit denial. These formulations use the same structural assumptions as Holocaust denial. Jewish people as a coordinated network of hidden power, without explicitly claiming that the Holocaust did not happen. They are Holocaust ideology without Holocaust denial. They advance the worldview that produced the Holocaust while maintaining formal distance from the event itself. The historical record is clear about where this worldview leads. Truth 35. The Einsatzgruppen killed 1.5 million people in shooting operations that are less known than the death camps. The popular understanding of the Holocaust centers on the death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, as the primary sites of mass murder. This understanding is accurate as far as it goes. The extermination camps killed approximately 3 million people and were the most systematic and most efficient killing facilities in the Holocaust. But it is incomplete because approximately 1.5 million additional Jews and hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs, Roma, and others were murdered in mass shooting operations conducted by the Einsatzgruppen and supporting police units in the occupied Soviet territories, with no death camp infrastructure whatsoever. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile killing units attached to the German army that followed the Wehrmacht's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. There were 4 Einsatzgruppen, A, B, C, and D, operating in different sectors of the Eastern Front. Each had several hundred to a few thousand members, including SS officers, police, and auxiliaries recruited from local populations. Their operational method was to arrive in a town or city, identify the Jewish population, concentrate them in a designated location, march them to a prepared site, a ravine, a forest, a pit dug by the victims themselves, and shoot them. Father Patrick Dubois, a French Catholic priest, has spent more than 20 years traveling through Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Russia, interviewing elderly witnesses who saw or heard the Einsatzgruppen operations and locating the mass graves. Many of them unmarked, most of them never officially documented, some of them still in use as farmland, that contained the remains of the victims. His work has identified more than 2,000 mass grave sites in Ukraine alone. The project has dramatically expanded the known geographic and numerical scope of the shooting operations and has demonstrated that the Holocaust by bullets, as Du Bois titled his account, was as comprehensive, as systematic, and as deliberately organized as the camp-based Holocaust, and that its sites are scattered across thousands of locations in Eastern Europe rather than concentrated in the 6 major death camp sites. The relative obscurity of the shooting operations and popular Holocaust understanding has practical consequences for memorial practice and for legal accountability. The sites identified by Du Bois and others remain largely unmarked. The witnesses are dying. The descendants of the victims often do not know where their families were murdered or that the field at the edge of a particular village is a grave containing hundreds of their relatives. The legal record of the shooting operations was addressed at Nuremberg in the Einsatzgruppen trial, but the vast majority of the perpetrators, the shooters themselves, the local auxiliaries, the truck drivers, and the diggers, faced no accountability whatsoever. Truth 36. The Versailles deception, propaganda, inspection, and the concealment of genocide. Versailles, known in Czech as Terezin, was a garrison town in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia that the SS converted into what they described as a model Jewish settlement, a ghetto that could be shown to outside observers as evidence that Jewish deportees were being treated humanely. It was used to deceive the International Red Cross, to reassure the families of Western European Jews who had been told their relatives were being resettled, and to produce Nazi propaganda films demonstrating Jewish self-governance. The reality was that their Versailles was a transit camp. Approximately 140,000 Jews passed through it, and approximately 90,000 of those were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau and other extermination facilities. Approximately 33,000 died in their Versailles itself from disease, starvation, and the conditions of overcrowded ghetto life. The Red Cross inspection of their Versailles in June 1944 is one of the most extensively analyzed and most uncomfortable episodes in the history of humanitarian organizations. The SS prepared the camp intensively for the inspection. Buildings were painted, gardens were planted, a children's pavilion was constructed, a A performance of the children's opera Brundabar was staged, shops were stocked with goods, and the population was temporarily reduced by deportations to Auschwitz to reduce the visible overcrowding. The Red Cross delegation inspected the camp and issued a report describing it as adequately managed. The report did not note the deportations that had preceded the inspection. It did not investigate the fate of the transferred inmates. It accepted the Potemkin village at face value. The Red Cross's failure at their Scienstadt is documented and has been extensively examined by the institution itself. The organization faced a fundamental structural problem. Its access to German-controlled territory was dependent on German cooperation, and German cooperation was conditional on the Red Cross not using whatever information it gathered to publicly challenge German treatment of prisoners. The Red Cross's primary focus during the war was on the treatment of Allied POWs, which fell more clearly under the Geneva Conventions, rather than on the treatment of civilian populations and concentration camp prisoners. These structural constraints do not fully excuse their Scienstadt report, but they provide context for how an institution with humanitarian intentions could participate in the concealment of mass murder. The Their Scienstadt deception also reveals the specific sophistication of the Nazi propaganda operation. The SS understood that international opinion mattered, not because it would stop the killing, but because it could accelerate or complicate various diplomatic and logistical aspects of the program. Managing the optics of Their Scienstadt cost resources and organizational effort. It was worth it because it neutralized potential international pressure. The lesson about the use of humanitarian theater to conceal atrocity is not confined to the Nazi period. It has been documented in subsequent genocides and state violence programs in various forms. Recognizing the specific pattern, the model facility, the prepared inspection, the cooperation with outside observers under controlled conditions, is a skill that the Their Scienstadt case teaches. Truth 37. Ordinary German civilians knew more than post-war mythology acknowledged. The post-war narrative among ordinary Germans, captured in the phrase that became a sociological object of study, "De von haben wir nichts gewusst," meaning we knew nothing about it, has been systematically undermined by historical research over the past several decades. The question of what ordinary Germans knew about the Holocaust, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge is one of the most extensively researched questions in Holocaust historiography, and the answer, while nuanced, is broadly that the claim of ignorance was vastly overstated. German soldiers on the Eastern Front wrote letters home that were censored but not consistently so, and many described, in language that was sometimes euphemistic but sometimes direct, what they had seen and participated in. The deportations from German cities, particularly the deportations from Berlin and other major cities in 1941 and 1942, were visible events. Jews were collected from their apartments, marched through streets to assembly points, loaded onto trains that departed from public railway stations. Neighbors watched. Shop owners watched. Children watched. The deportees were gone and did not return. The connection between deportation and death was not available in detail to most German civilians, but the fact of mass deportation and the likely fate of the deported was not a secret available only to SS insiders. Robert Gellatly's Backing Hitler documents the extent to which the German population was informed of and largely supportive of the broad outlines of Nazi racial policy, even if the specific details of the extermination program were not universally known. The camps, not the extermination camps, but the concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, were publicly known from their establishment in 1933. Their existence was reported in the German press. Former prisoners, upon release, spread information about conditions through private networks. The German public's relationship to this knowledge was shaped by a combination of genuine ignorance of the most extreme details, willful failure to seek information that was clearly available, and in many cases conscious support for what the camps represented. The implications for contemporary situations are direct. The claim, "I did not know," has been used in the context of every subsequent genocide and atrocity to describe the position of civilian populations in perpetrator countries. The historical research into German civilian knowledge of the Holocaust establishes that this claim is typically a significant understatement. Information about atrocity is usually available to civilian populations through exactly the channels it was available in Germany. Soldiers' accounts, visible deportations, the absence of deported populations, economic benefiting from victims' property, and the general social atmosphere of a society that is organizing itself around a persecutory project. The choice not to know is itself a moral choice with moral consequences. Truth 38. The collaborating churches and the rescuing churches left a complicated legacy. The relationship between Christian institutions and the Holocaust is one of the most uncomfortable and least resolved areas of Holocaust history for the institutions themselves. The Catholic Church and the Protestant churches of Germany both produced significant numbers of individuals who collaborated with or acquiesced to Nazi racial policy, and both produced individuals who resisted it at great personal risk. The institutional response of the churches, as distinct from the individual responses of clergy and laity, was, in most cases, deeply inadequate to the scale of the moral challenge they faced. Pope Pius XII's response to the Holocaust, or rather, his absence of a public response, has been the subject of sustained historical and theological controversy for decades. The historical debate centers on whether Pius XII, who had extensive knowledge of the deportations and killings through Vatican intelligence networks, made a calculated decision that a public denunciation would expose Catholics in occupied territories to reprisals and would not in fact halt the killing, or whether his silence reflected a combination of personal anti-Semitism, institutional timidity, and anti-communism that led him to prioritize the Church's institutional interests over the lives of Jews. The opening of the Vatican archives relevant to the Pius XII period, which began in 2020, has produced extensive new documentation but has not resolved the core debate. The German Protestant churches produced the Confessing Church, the movement led by figures including Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller that resisted the Deutsche Christen movement's attempt to align Protestant Christianity with Nazi ideology. The Confessing Church's resistance was primarily theological rather than explicitly political, and it did not consistently extend to resistance to the persecution of Jews. Bonhoeffer, who was executed by the SS in April 1945 for his involvement in the resistance conspiracy against Hitler, did advocate for Jewish people in ways that most of his colleagues did not, and his theology of resistance has been enormously influential in subsequent generations. But he was exceptional rather than representative. Against this record of institutional failure and individual courage must be placed the extraordinary acts of specific Christian communities. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, the Huguenot village in southern France where the pastor André Trocmé led a community that sheltered approximately 3,500 Jewish refugees, is the most celebrated example. Denmark's Lutheran Church provided leadership in the national rescue effort that preserved approximately 99% of Denmark's Jewish community. Thousands of individual Catholics and Protestants across Europe risked their lives to hide Jewish neighbors, provide false documents, and resist the deportations. These individuals, recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations, currently numbering approximately 27,000, demonstrate that the choice to resist was available and was made. The fact that it was available and was not made by more people is the institutional indictment that the churches have spent the post-war decades working to address. Truth 39. The business of Holocaust tourism and memory has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, with complicated implications. Approximately 2.3 million people visited the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in 2023, making it one of the most visited memorial sites in the world and one of the most visited tourist destinations in Poland. The majority of visitors are not Jewish. The majority are not from countries whose Jewish populations were directly targeted in the Holocaust. They are tourists, in the specific economic and cultural sense. People who have chosen to visit a specific location as part of a broader experience of travel, who pay for admission, who purchase guide services, who use the associated parking facilities and visitor center and cafe, and who leave. Many of them are deeply moved. Many of them take selfies. Some of them take selfies in front of the gas chamber ruins. The ethics of Holocaust tourism, what is sometimes called dark tourism or thanatourism, is a genuine subject of academic inquiry and institutional tension. The Auschwitz Museum, which has published guidelines for respectful visitor behavior and which operates a significant educational program for schools and adult groups, faces the fundamental challenge of any institution that must simultaneously serve as a memorial, an educational center, and a tourist attraction in a country where tourism is a significant economic activity. The commercial dimension of Holocaust memory, the gift shops at Holocaust museums, the tourism revenue associated with major memorial sites, the film industry built around Holocaust narratives, creates tensions that are not simply resolvable by good intentions. The selfie controversy, documented extensively in media coverage of visitors photographing themselves at Auschwitz in ways that memorial staff and survivors find offensive, reflects a broader tension in contemporary memorial culture between the demand for personal, shareable experience and the imperative of respectful witness. The Auschwitz Museum maintains an active social media presence that sometimes includes images of visitors behaving in ways the institution finds inappropriate, with the stated purpose of educating the public about appropriate memorial conduct. The tension is not between good people and bad people. It is between the specific demands of Holocaust memory and the habits of a culture organized around personal documentation and social sharing. The commodification of Holocaust memory also extends to film, literature, and other cultural production. The Holocaust has generated an enormous body of cultural work, from Primo Levi's memoirs to Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, to Schindler's List, to The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, that varies enormously in historical accuracy, artistic achievement, and ethical seriousness. Some of this work is extraordinary. Some of it reduces the Holocaust to a backdrop for personal growth narratives or romantic plots in ways that Elie Wiesel and other survivors found deeply offensive. The question of who has the right to tell the Holocaust story, in what form, for what audience, and with what obligations to historical accuracy and to the dignity of victims, is a question that does not have a settled answer and that each generation must negotiate for itself. Truth 40. Every mechanism of the Holocaust exists in some form in the contemporary world. The 40th truth is the one that connects all the others. It is not a comfortable truth, but it is the truth that makes all of the preceding truths consequential rather than merely historical. Every mechanism that the Holocaust required, and we have examined many of them tonight, exists in some form in the contemporary world. Not in the same combination, not with the same intensity, not yet at the same scale, but the components are present, and the history demonstrates with terrible clarity what can happen when they are assembled. The bureaucratic normalization of persecution, the process by which administrative systems convert moral catastrophe into routine paperwork, so that each individual in the chain is doing something that seems professionally ordinary while the aggregate is atrocity. This process is recognizable in contemporary immigration enforcement systems, in counterterrorism detention frameworks, in the administrative processing of refugee claims in conditions that amount to systematic cruelty. The specific form differs from the Judenreferenten and the RSHA. The structural dynamic is the same. The scapegoating of a minority population as the source of a majority's economic and cultural anxieties, with escalating rhetoric that moves from complaint to dehumanization to demands for action, is a pattern documented in the contemporary political environments of multiple democracies. The specific population targeted varies by country and context. The rhetorical structure, the identification of a group, the attribution of malign collective intent, the claim that the group's presence or influence is incompatible with the well-being of the majority, is consistent and recognizable. The failure of international institutions, the refusal of major powers to subordinate national interests to humanitarian obligations, the use of veto power to block international response to documented atrocities, The reliance on diplomatic process in situations that require urgent action is not a post-war innovation. It is the same pattern that allowed the Holocaust to proceed while the Allied governments received accurate intelligence about the death camps and declined to act. The corruption of the legal system through the appointment of ideologically committed judges, the rewriting of laws to exclude targeted populations from legal protection, the use of emergency powers to override ordinary legal constraints. These are not simply features of totalitarianism that democracies are immune to. They are features of political systems under pressure that require active institutional resistance and an engaged citizenry to prevent. The history of how they developed in Germany between 1933 and 1939 is a detailed map of a process that democracies elsewhere have not always successfully resisted. None of this is to say that any contemporary situation is equivalent to the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a singular event in its systematic character, its ideological totality, its bureaucratic organization, and its ultimate scale. Inappropriate comparisons diminish the victims of the Holocaust and obscure the specific conditions that made it possible. The appropriate use of Holocaust history is not to make casual analogies, but to understand the mechanisms well enough to recognize their early forms, to see, in the rhetoric and the laws and the institutional arrangements of contemporary politics, the particular combinations of elements that the historical record identifies as warning signs. The 40th truth is this: the Holocaust was not inevitable. At every stage of its development, from the early discriminatory legislation to the deportations to the gas chambers, it was possible for individuals, institutions, and governments to make different choices. Some did. The Danes saved their Jews. Luchambon sheltered thousands. Individual SS officers refused orders and faced no serious consequence. The international community could have bombed the rail lines. The State Department could have transmitted the Regner telegram. The Red Cross could have refused to inspect their science data on the terms the SS offered. Every one of these things was possible. Most of them are not done. The question that the Holocaust ultimately poses is not a historical question. It is a present tense question. Not how did this happen, but what will you do today in the specific circumstances of your own place and time when the mechanisms are visible and the choice is still available? That question does not have an abstract answer. It has only a concrete one, made in the specific choices of a specific life and specific circumstances. The history gives you the knowledge. The choice is always yours. 40 truths. 40 areas of suppressed, disputed, inadequately taught, or politically uncomfortable historical knowledge. Each one connecting the Holocaust, the most extensively documented genocide in human history, to the present day in ways that are not metaphorical, but specific, mechanistic, and actionable. We have moved through impunity and its consequences. Fewer than 1% of perpetrators prosecuted. West Germany rebuilt with perpetrators in office. CIA assets with blood on their hands. Swiss banks holding stolen money for 50 years. Corporations paying symbolic settlements for decades of slave labor. Austria and France spending nearly half a century in deliberate amnesia. We have moved through the failures of international action. The Allied governments who knew about the death camps and did not bomb the rail lines. The Bermuda Conference designed to accomplish nothing. The Red Cross inspecting their science data and filing a favorable report. The never again pledge broken in Cambodia and Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur. We have moved through the living dimensions of the history. The 1.2 million victims who remain unnamed. The physical evidence deteriorating at Auschwitz and Sobibor, and in the unmarked mass graves across Eastern Europe. The last witnesses dying. The biological inheritance of trauma in survivor families. The children of perpetrators in the shadow of what their parents did. And we have moved through the contemporary connections. Social media amplifying denial to billions. The Great Replacement theory and the genealogy of the worst anti-Semitic violence in American history. Baltic states rehabilitating Holocaust collaborators. Hungary rehabilitating Horthy. Poland attempting to criminalize accurate history. Neo-Nazis in law enforcement and military. The ICC under attack. Holocaust denial approaching the political mainstream. The full weight of this history is not something any single person can carry alone, or should try to. The institutions built to carry it, the memorial museums, the research archives, the testimony collections, the educational programs, the legal frameworks, exist precisely because the individual human capacity for remembrance is finite and the collective need for it is not. Using those institutions, supporting them, pushing them to be more complete and more honest and more connected to contemporary relevance. This is how individual engagement with this history becomes something larger than personal education. The Holocaust happened. It was documented in extraordinary detail by the people who carried it out and by those who survived it and by the investigators who examined its aftermath. It was enabled by mechanisms that are human, institutional, recognizable, and not extinct. It has consequences that are ongoing in the bodies of survivors' children, in the unrecovered identities of 1.2 million victims, in the unresolved financial claims, in the rehabilitated perpetrators, and the political movements that carry forward some version of the ideology that produced it. And it has, within that history, examples of resistance, rescue, testimony, and moral courage that demonstrate, as clearly as the history of failure demonstrates its opposite, that different choices were possible and are possible. The people who hid their neighbors at the cost of their own lives. The people who testified when testimony was dangerous. The lawyers who insisted on legal accountability when their colleagues insisted it was impractical. The journalists who published what they had seen when their governments preferred silence. They were not special categories of human being. They were people who, at the specific moment when the choice was available, made the choice. If you made it through all 40 of these truths, whether you were fully awake for every word, or whether you drifted through them in the half-conscious space between waking and sleep, where the most important things sometimes settle most deeply, thank you. This history is worth your attention, every bit of it, in all its uncomfortable, unresolved, contemporary relevance. Subscribe if you want this kind of history in your life. Like if this found you. And rest now. You have done serious work tonight. The history is here, held in the record, waiting for whenever you need it. Sleep well.